How's that going?
Transfigure that.
Honestly,
I'm Isaac. I'm the president here at Roswell. Today, we're talking about transhumanism. It's just transcending humanity and how far like technology can go, and eventually like uploading our brains to like a database. Yeah. So we have some events going on. If you don't know, the Frank Turek event is on the 21st from 6 to 9 in the School of Business in the town's auditorium. That way. Yeah, that'll be good. We're trying to get a co-sponsor for that. We haven't got that yet. And then tomorrow, if you want to join the group me, there's more information. You see these little yellow QR codes. You can scan that. And Mario is hosting a watch party for Ghost in the Shell. It's a good movie. It's a weird movie, but it's a good movie. And yeah, so Mario's gonna talk about transhumanism.
Thanks. So if you didn't hear at the very beginning, that's Isaac. He's the president of Ratio Christi. Ratio Christi is an apologetics ministry here on campus. And we talk about, hopefully, important things that are meaningful. So one of the things this week we're going to talk about is this thing called transhumanism. So my connection to Liberty is I've got two sons that have graduated from Liberty and a daughter who's currently there who doesn't want to be known. But so we're kind of all in on Liberty. I've recently got involved in RC, Ratio Christi, myself, but I'm really, really excited to be involved. So I grew up in a nominally Christian home. But as soon as I went to college, secular university, Penn State, I pretty much jettisoned anything having to do with any semblance of faith. So I was, where you are now. Hopefully in a better place, because I was not in a good place. I was in a very, very dark place, frankly. I was looking for answers, who I was, why I was here. But I had no one give me answers. All the answers that I had found were lacking. I was pretty lost. I truly was on the edge of despair. And at 22, I basically decided that life wasn't worth living. 22. I mean, it only took 22 years to realize that life as it was not worth living. So I did the math, kept coming up with 0, 0, 0, sometimes less than 0. That's what life was. But that's where God found me. So I'm, be encouraged in that, if you're struggling with your faith, etc., RC hopefully can answer some of those questions. That is one of our purposes here, is to encourage each other in our faith. But I've never been the same, and if you want to hear that story, we'll do that another time, because today we have a different topic we're talking about. What is transhumanism? So you may not be familiar with the term, but it's really not new. In the 70s, I don't think anybody here remembers the 70s except a few. But in the 70s, there was a very, very popular TV show. And I'm going to play you the intro to it.
Powering on. Welcome to All Tech Dancing.
So again, popular TV show. We would wait up to watch this every week. And this is when TV, something was broadcast and you had to wait for it. You may not be familiar with this concept. It's not something you just load up. We had to wait, and if we were good enough that week, we could stay up late enough to watch it. Our parents would let us. But this is the intro.
Separation. Inboard and outboard, they're on. We're coming forward with the side snake. All looks good. I've got a blowout. Neighbor 3. Get your pitch to 0. Pitches out. I can't hold altitude. Correction. Alpha hold is off. Prep selected. Emergency. Flight column. I can't hold it. She's breaking up. She's breaking. Steve Austin, astronaut. A man barely alive. Gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We have the capability to make the world's first bionic man. Steve Austin will be that man. Better than he was before. Better Stronger. Faster.
So that was awesome. The memories, that music, especially when he's running, as a young boy, we wanted to be this guy because he was the best. He was superhuman. And ladies, because of the popularity of the show, they actually came out with the Bionic Woman. So there were 2 shows, and yes, they eventually got together because it's Hollywood, and that's what Hollywood does. So, $6 million, $6 million. At least then, it was a lot of money. But the premise of the story was there was this terrible accident. And interestingly enough, the footage in that showing that spacecraft tumbling in the desert actually happened. This is actually based on a historical event. The guy made it out alive. They didn't reconstruct him into a bionic person, but that was sort of the premise. But obviously there was this terrible accident, and something needed to be done. So at that point, most people could say that's probably a good thing. So the lines in the intro were, we can rebuild him. We have the technology. We can make him better than he was before. Better, stronger, faster. So this is basically the idea of transhumanism. Transhumanism is a way to restore, if not enhance, the biological creature, human being. And at that point, maybe it's not something we would disagree with, but it tends to go farther. And as these human ideas tend to do, they tend to go further and further, and sometimes in places they're unexpected. Because we've gone from rebuilding him to making him better. Right? Why? Because we have the technology. Because we can. Very common thinking. So this is early 1970s. This is 50 years ago people talked about this, but this idea is actually older than that. So transhumanism at its basic kind of definition can just be the enhancement of the human through technology. And things like glasses, a pacemaker, or even a calculator, these things extend our abilities in some way, right? Glasses help us to see better, a pacemaker regulates our heart, and cognitively a calculator allows us to actually do things that we couldn't do, naturally, so to speak. So at that point, all we're basically saying is that, well, if something is better, it's better, right? Fairly simple. That's really what the $6 million man was doing. We need to be better, and better is where we ought to go. Where this goes today, because of the things that we have now entered into, again, 1970s, no personal computers, no internet, no smartphones, etc. As far as the technology that has been pushing this new movement, what are called the NBIC technologies, things like nanotechnology, biotechnology, information technology, and cognitive science. We're at the point now where better is really not good enough. So there's been a change from just better for better's sake to better, well, we really ought to go well beyond that. Better, frankly, is just not good enough. So today, transhumanism is more accurately stated this way. It's the philosophy and science of using technology to transcend the physical, mental, and psychological limitations of humanity via self-directed human evolution. So this isn't just that better is good or better is better. This is ultimately this concept of humanity plus. So you take humanity and you make it more than it currently is. Very different perspective than the sort of restorative technologies that fix something that's broken. Like I'm wearing eyeglasses because I don't have great vision. It's fixing something that was already there. As opposed to what this is saying is that we can self-direct our progress in ways that aren't restorative, but are enhancements or augmentations. Very, very different perspective. So that priority of making things better isn't intrinsically wrong, right? I mean, We live in a fallen world. We struggle. How hard does life have to be? We want things to be better for a good reason. But some of the things that are going on, again, deal with this issue of transcending the actual limitations of our body. So the Transhumanist Declaration, Article 1, states more than just making things better. Humanity stands to be profoundly affected by science and technology in the future. We envision the possibility of broadening human potential by overcoming aging, cognitive shortcomings, involuntary suffering, and our confinement to planet Earth. So all of a sudden, we've gone from a set of eyeglasses to help me see better to somehow leaving Earth, right? And this isn't something that is limited to a small group of people. Some very powerful, very wealthy folks are pushing this idea. Elon Musk is probably one of the folks you would consider dealing with this issue of confinement, right? He wants to go to Mars, occupy Mars. I'm not saying Elon Musk is a powerful person, don't get me wrong, but the point is there are powerful people with a lot of money that are pushing these perspectives in a way that, as the church, we have a right to say, well, wait a second, why are we doing what we're doing? Now, some of these issues aren't intrinsically wrong, right? Dealing with aging, brain function, suffering, confinement. And confinement, I'm going to also not just limit to confinement on Earth, but confinement in our own physical bodies. I think both of those things can kind of be brought under the same transhumanist perspective. It's not just a physical reason to leave our planet, but there are reasons perhaps to leave our bodies as well. And who would have a problem with aging and making life longer? Longevity is an issue, right? We want to live longer for obvious reasons. Similarly, as far as brain function, we want to be able to think better. You know, if we have damage to our brains, if we have diseases, we want to think clearly, etc. Nothing wrong there. And the amelioration of suffering is also, you know, an imperative. Why would we want people to suffer, etc. But as you see, some of these things start going in places where we have to question why. So, aging to longevity. Are we talking then about immortality? Folks in the transhumanist movement are talking about immortality. As far as brain function and cognitive enhancements, cyborgs, cyber organisms, creatures that are half or partially human and augmented in a way where machines or other technologies are enhancing them, that's also a goal. The idea of the amelioration of suffering, sure, we want that, but the panacea is to eliminate suffering. Panacea was the Greek goddess of remedy, of healing. So I use that term because the idea isn't just to ameliorate or make suffering manageable, it is to eliminate it. And probably the strangest issue, I think, is this idea of confinement, which from a perspective of planetary sort of travels, deals with colonization of other planets. But it really goes to this thing called singularity. In transhumanist movements, you'll hear this topic, singularity. And singularity is defined as when the human can upload perhaps its entire consciousness, its entire brain functions to a computer or the net or the web. So folks call that singularity. There's another definition of singularity that folks use in this movement, which is when a artificial intelligence gets to be advanced enough where it can write its own programs and can develop itself, and therefore has this exponential possibility of growth intellectually. They call that a singularity, and there's all kinds of fears about what that thing, whatever that being is, might actually do. But you see how these things seem to start in things that we would, as Christians, if you are a Christian, would support, right? So I want to kind of camp out here, and this isn't just going to be me talking to you. I really want to hear about your thoughts on this. What do you guys think about this idea that we start with aging and longevity, and the question then becomes, well, can we make death just a disease that is curable? Similarly with brain function, at what point do we interface with machines to the extent where that boundary isn't visible anymore, where that blurring is such that you don't really know where one begins and what ends. And similarly with the idea of suffering. So I want to hear what your thoughts are on some of these concepts. How would you approach some of these suggestions of where we might go with these areas?
Well, I think that like immortality in a worldview where it's just I guess a naturalistic worldview. Why exactly? I don't know if someone would want to be immortal in a sense, because the universe isn't itself immortal. It's gonna eventually on that worldview burn up. The heat death, our planet is gonna burn up. Entropy is still gonna take place. Everything's gonna still break down. So essentially, it's going to be just you.
But it seems like they want to be there to watch it happen.
Right.
That's the only thing I can think of, right? In X billions of years or however long we have, the sun's going to burn out. I guess they want a front row seat, right?
Yeah.
They want to be there. I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek, but it's a good question, right? But this is one of these driving forces. Yeah, just talk. Just please yell out.
I think that like the second thing of maybe not depending on what cognitive enhancement refers to, I guess
It refers to everything. Everything you can imagine.
Okay.
That's what it refers to.
Some things I think that would be a good thing, other things not so much. But I feel like most of the second things like aren't necessarily bad, like increasing people's lifespan. I don't see any moral problems with that. Setting up like a human outpost on Mars.
Well, increasing 100 years, 1,000 years. I mean, the idea of immortality and some sort of not having an ability to die is one thing. But if we were to get another 100 years, 50 years, or 200 years, or 1,000 years, and still die, where would that kind of go?
I mean, that might bring up some interesting ethical questions, but I don't think in of itself that's necessarily wrong. I mean, if you think about like people in Bible times, like they still lived hundreds of years. They weren't immortal, but they did have longer lifespans. And
Sure. And again, from the Christian perspective, we would say in some ways maybe that's restorative, right? You would maybe restore something to what it was originally meant to be, and that's an open question. I think that's a discussion worth having. But again, I'm trying to give the impression of I think what is happening here is that's not generally viewed as enough. It's always going well beyond, really to the end, right? To the
eternal life without God.
Yeah. I mean that if you can have 100 years, why not have 1,000 or more?
I have is, would it be available to everyone? By everyone, I don't mean just, anybody can get it, or anybody has the ability to get it. I'm saying, is it available to everyone, like, from the get-go?
Well, we're going to put a pin on that because, frankly, I think that is one of the best questions about this issue that a lot of folks are not truly understanding. On its surface, this is very egalitarian. And almost everyone who kind of talks about this assumes that, sure, this is if it's good for me, it must be good for you. But then there are practical implications of cost, the technology itself in terms of availability. Is it going to be a democratic thing? I mean, the folks that are pushing this are folks like, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, who's the PayPal guy. These guys are billionaires, right? And it's sort of interesting how those guys always seem to be the ones pushing this because they have the resources, perhaps to even achieve those things. The real question becomes, and again, we are going to get back to that, so I just want to put a pause in that for a second, because who decides is the big question. That is I think, one of the biggest questions to answer. And I'm going to address it in a little later slide, so I want to come back to that. So if I don't, you come back at me. But we will get to that.
So Mario, perhaps my comments are a little off topic, but the first thing that comes to mind when I hear this is, I believe it was Thomas Jefferson who said, "He who trades freedom for security deserves and gains neither." Ultimately, I do believe technology is going to advance, and they might make progress along these lines, but ultimately it's not going to work. It's going to fail spectacularly because there's a few things that you can't solve with technology. You can't solve human nature. And we have gained in technology over the last 100 years, but it didn't stop World War I or II. It didn't stop all these problems, even problems like Ukraine and Russia, because you can't solve man's
So
nature.
are you saying this is overly optimistic?
Well, yes, because even if you have people that are superhumans, because they can live longer, they're smarter, there's still going to be greed. There's still going to be, ill will, because I believe in original sin, and there's still going to be problems. And
But if our mind is simply some sort of code and embedded in some sort of structure, happens to be organic, couldn't you tweak that? Couldn't you change that code? Maybe eliminate those things?
well, perhaps the people in charge who are manipulating it, if we ever got that far, they'll might be trying to assert their control, but there's always going to be rivals going to hack into all the people.
I would say you asked a loaded question, and I think that's where you're going with all this.
Well, I was going to say that's not very optimistic of you.
I agree with her. I think that
One interest,
there's no such
last
thing
comment,
as
and I don't want to
Just
be.
real quick, yeah, make it quick though.
One interesting thing is, and not to monopolize the conversation. So up to this date, if you look at successful people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, Mark Zuckerberg, who are pushing this stuff, interestingly enough, that these guys aren't the smartest guys. A lot of times, success in life is random chance. The race doesn't go to the strong or the swift. So even if you have a super body and a super mind, there's still going to be people that might be a little dumber. They're going to succeed more because a good life and success and health often isn't dependent on smarts or bodily or performance. It's more time and chance.
Unless you control everything.
Yeah, unless you get to that point. But
So you were saying?
It's like a cyborg definitely is going to get hacked into. Terrible idea. If our
Terrible.
brains, if the data from our brain was connected to a computer, then our data isn't. Then that's insecure. So that's not going to happen.
What if it was just like a limb or something, though? Like, think Star Wars, like with cyborg arm or
That
something.
arm is getting paralyzed, blown up.
Well, if it's a cold
Well, the maintenance issues, right? This is one thing that often is overlooked. These are highly complicated machines, even machines that we use today, like airplanes and et cetera. Very, very high maintenance levels are required. So the question also becomes, going back to how egalitarian it is, your question is, who are the people that are fixing the machines as opposed to the people who are using or taking the advantage of the machines, right? So again, you seem very
Also, there's
pessimistic about this.
Let's think about it. Like, would I add a gun to my arm? Probably not, because I'm not going to be going to war.
Oh, I'm adding a gun to mine.
I'm going to send a tank to war, and now I'm going to have like all these electronic tanks that don't have humans in them blow each other up.
You were saying?
It's more of a philosophical question, to be honest. But I would say most of these priorities, you essentially negate what would humanity, meaning to our humanity. So, for example, if we live forever, what's the point in living? It's almost like
Well, the goal in most of these perspectives has to do with happiness or fulfillment. So the assumption is, if I have more time, that gives me more time to be fulfilled, to be happy, to experience these things.
There's a technology on here that could.
I've not covered everything.
Oh yeah.
But go ahead.
But sort of that idea of happiness, that brings to mind something else that sort of falls under this transhumanist. If you're able to like hack into the brain, if you're able to like manipulate it using machinery or whatever, like if you had an machine implant or something, then theoretically it would be possible to like flip the switch that makes you happy all the time.
Sure.
And that...
And you can do that with drugs, perhaps. You can do it with other kinds of things. They wouldn't have to be technology per se in a mechanical sense.
But
they could be other kinds of enhancements.
with the technology, though, you'd be able to keep that switch. Maybe. I don't know this for sure. You might be able to keep that switch flipped on all the time. And that would bring with it a whole slew of ethical questions and problems.
It'd be like clown world, right? Everybody's just happy. Everybody's a clown. Or maybe everybody's a joker in that world.
I think
The brain would get used to like the neurotransmitters, and then
say we're using dopamine, your brain will get used to the dopamine levels, and your new baseline would be at dopamine level 5 rather than dopamine level 0, just to throw a number on it.
true.
And then we no longer have that. Rather than just going to blank stone face expression,
Right.
like I have right now, it will feel like you've dropped well below 0.
Right. So yeah.
So you're going to be relying on an external drop. And I think philosophically, struggle is sacred. And that's not what transhumanism takes in.
Say that again. Struggle is
sacred.
Struggle is sacred.
The first commandment was to be fruitful and multiply, and that implies work. Even if it was enjoyable work, it's
good work.
Yeah, it's still work.
I want to say something. I do like considering things from more historical and political ideas. You had, throughout history, say in the French Revolution, say in Communist Russia, say in China today, they may have not had the technology today, but these regimes had the ability to try to force perfectionism through complete government control. It failed. You know, and none of these ideas are going to work, and actually it's going to be used for great evil. Like what the Chinese government is doing now, they are giving self-destructing military helmets on their soldiers. They're starting to phase it in. So if a soldier is going to be cowardly, you just press the button and it blows the helmet. This is true. The Chinese government is working on implementing this. So that's not quite a cyber, but it's an extension of the idea. All these ideas are going to be used for no good.
Well, some of them would be. I'm sorry. Continue.
Ultimately.
Can you apply that logic to any single advancement in technology, though?
Yeah.
Like, you could say that about smartphones. You could say, or any, the revolution of computers. China is going to have more access to their citizens' information.
The internet can be used for cyber attacks.
Yeah. So therefore, we shouldn't have the internet. I feel like that's. I don't know. There's much more.
I don't think that's what he was saying. We don't want to get into a false dichotomy and go back to the Stone Age because somehow that's somehow more godlike. Right?
Yeah, but you could.
God would be pleased if we hunted with bows and arrows somehow. But the question I think is a fair one in the sense of given what we know about history. So this isn't purely a technological argument, right? One reason we're talking about it here, and Ratio Christi talks about and engages these issues, is we talk about these things from a philosophical perspective, a historical perspective, as well as a biblical perspective. So these things are not meant to be standalone ideas or concepts. The problem becomes when these things do take on sort of a life of their own. And of course, the question is who's controlling, as far as some of these, whether it's a state actor or it could just as easily be business. When you mentioned phones, what we're seeing, I think, today is a lot of this subtle kind of movement and blurring the line between our sort of personalities on our phones. Or who has a cell phone? You have one? If you were to hand it to the person next to you, just for like 10 minutes, what would you think about that? What would you think about that? Oh, no, and give them your password. So, the reality is that something about this thing actually is part of our personality already. So we have some half steps towards some of these things. And the reason to think clearly about these and critically about these things is to make decisions. Otherwise, some of these things will happen all by themselves. It may be an actor like government, but it may well be, especially sort of in a liberal democracy, it may be business interests who are not necessarily looking to control you so much as influence you. Right? Now, if they could simply just send you a text that says deposit $50 into McDonald's bank account, if that would work, they would do it, right? But that isn't going to work, at least right now. Could we be conditioned to do those kinds of things? I think it's a valid question. But I only bring up the example of the phone to make us realize that these things have an influence on us already. So we ought to be cognizant of those things. And to your point about who decides, who is giving us these abilities and why? Right? Are we being given apps and phones and all these other things because it just helps us to be more influenceable for a later event or a later time, etc. These are things that ought to be considered.
Yeah, this just makes me think about this guy that I actually saw recently. I think he's like the first legal cyborg, technically. That's, or at least he calls himself
Yeah, I was going to
that.
say, there are people who are doing this. They're literally implanting, mechanical and or electronic parts into their body. Go ahead.
Yeah, because the guy I'm thinking of, he was born colorblind, and so he got this little implant in his head that allows him to see color around him. And like, he's a big proponent of being a cyborg, adding all these mechanical parts to you and stuff. But when I look at that, I don't see a problem with being able to not be colorblind anymore. Like, that's really cool. It's almost like a medical procedure where you just get your vision fixed or something and you're not colorblind anymore. But
Or like
it's an
getting a
implant.
pacemaker.
Yeah, it's mechanical, but it's like, where is the line where that is?
Well, I think a helpful thing is to delineate these things into restorative versus enhancements. And I think that's probably one of the things as folks who want to speak into this, that we look at that and understand. Because what these guys are addressing are the products of what we would say is the fall. Right? And of course, death being the main product of that fall. So we understand as believers. We don't say, nah, why worry about this nonsense, as if we're just, pie in the sky, things will be better later. No, I think we have an obligation to take care and be stewards of what we've been given. But where they start and where they end up seems to be the real issue. So let me just move on, because as much as some of these things seem to be, a little off the beaten path in terms of what people may want to do with them, you'll see that some folks really understand this more in a religious-like basis. So this is David Pearce. He's the co-founder of Humanity Plus. That's Humanity Plus's logo. Used to be the World Transhumanist Association. So notice the specifics of his quote regarding things that have nothing really to do with technology. Think about this. If we want to live in paradise, we will have to engineer it ourselves. If we want eternal life, then we'll need to rewrite our bug-ridden genetic code and become godlike. Only high-tech solutions can ever eradicate suffering from the world. Compassion alone is not enough. So what he's looking for is a godlike eternal life in a paradise without suffering. Have you heard that before? Has that promise, this thing, been held out as a goal? Has that ever been talked about before?
Sure, Genesis, right off.
Yeah, and this is why I call this Eden 2.0. Because the lie in Genesis was, you will surely not die. You will be like God. There are these religious overtones to this thing that supposedly is purely, quote-unquote, scientific or purely material or purely having to do with technology. It seems, frankly, that you can't get away from that. And as much as folks on our side can be a little smug about that, it's like, well, this is our perspective, you have nothing to do with this. There are transhumanists of the Mormon variety. There's a Mormon Transhumanist Association. There's a Christian Transhumanist Association. And there's a place in Florida called the Church of Perpetual Life. It's a little hard to read. But this is an actual church where people go and talk to this guy, basically like a vitamin salesman. It's kind of what he is, as far as I can gather. But there are folks who are basically have decided they're not going to die. And one way they do that is they look at research that's being done in biotechnology and medicine and pharmacology. They'll read things, and then they'll go and buy stuff on some off-beaten tracks, maybe even the black market, and they'll just test it on themselves. So their own little guinea pigs. But the idea is that they do not want to die. So again, this is a strongly attractive theme because of the spiritual overtones that are involved here. You can understand. If you go to the Christian Transhumanist Association website, frankly, it's a lot of drivel and tripe as far as what Jesus wants to do in your life with technology. But some folks believe it. Now, you may understand why the Mormons would go after this. Mormons actually believe, from a religious perspective, that you can become a god. You will eventually become a god on your own planet, just like God who runs this planet was a human being at one time. So for them, I can understand why this seems like a perfect venue, or avenue, I should say, for that. Really don't understand what Christians, why they have any business dealing with this. But again, the religious overtones are there. And that has to be understood. As much as these folks are, wearing white lab coats and they're being very theoretical and talking about, engineering and all kinds of other things, you cannot get away from this. The thing, what they're trying to deal with ultimately, they're trying to correct something that occurred from our perspective that clearly is instigated by the fall. This is why we are where we are. So we agree on the problem, if you will, but our solutions clearly are very, very different. So transhumanism is a variety of things. One of the things it is materialistic. So all that exists is matter in motion. Matter in motion is all there is. And essentially, because of that, all knowledge is quantifiable. You can code it with zeros and ones, zeros and ones. So this is, again, where we're going to have some back and forth. So the question that I think comes from that is then, what is consciousness? What is the mind? And is there a soul? If this is a materialistic, it starts with a materialistic premise. Are these questions even worth asking? And if we can ask the questions, then where this goes will not include any of the input that these questions might actually have. And I think, again, this is a problem. This is very, very difficult. I mean, what are your thoughts? Is everything zeros and ones, atoms in motion? Because if it is, then this is much more plausible. This whole perspective actually is plausible, much more plausible than not, perhaps.
I think that all knowledge is quantifiable. I think that it could be data. But I think that consciousness is not material.
Wouldn't consciousness have some part of that knowledge? In other words, you'd have to have knowledge of the consciousness, number one, right? But if you're conscious and you interact with these things, facts, etc., and that becomes knowledge.
So like our soul, like that's what makes us who we are, like me and you.
Well, the materialists would say that doesn't exist. Just outright doesn't exist.
Yeah,
they would have a hard time quantifying even the mind. That is still hard. Very, very difficult. This idea of the interplay between the mind and consciousness. That is a huge problem for any materialist, not just transhumanists. Atheists who have the same kind of opinion that aren't necessarily transhumanists still struggle with this idea of mind and consciousness. But soul is right off the table. I mean, that's sort of an in-house discussion maybe among us, but that is not being discussed. So, you think consciousness, because it has knowledge or components of knowledge, then is quantifiable? I don't mean quantifiable as if, being able to talk about a thing as sort of an object. What I mean is it's codable, meaning it's reducible to code at some level. Maybe a really, really long code, very complex code, but it's actual, can be synthesized, if you will, down to some sort of code.
If I were to use a programming example, I would say that there are a lot of things that are readily accessible to our minds. We can manipulate the code in names and even go to certain classes.
The code in what? Manipulate the code in?
Speaking in a metaphor. So, like, I am a computer scientist.
Sure. No, you have a lot to say about this. Just make it understandable.
Yes. So, if I were to... So, we have a lot of access to manipulate, like, main, which is where all our main logic goes, the one that most people would interact with the most. And even a little bit deeper into the code, like certain classes, like the mind. But beyond that, I would say you don't have access to it. It's essentially private. We can't access it.
Well, they would say yet. Maybe we can't access it yet.
Yeah?
Are you saying it's inaccessible?
Completely inaccessible.
Completely. Now, why would you say that?
Because in one sense, I'm trying to not use though essentially something that somebody else wouldn't be able to understand. Like I'm trying to assume base level that they don't know Christ, they don't know God in that way. So I would say that to warn myself to do this again, we can manipulate the body pretty easily. We can manipulate the brain. But the second you start going into more of like things that are not quite tangible, things that aren't directly influenced, then
Right, and this is the basic issue with this, of course, something that's not tangible. That word tangible means something that has to do with sensory, right? It's sensory, or it has some sort of objectivity to it that can be revealed or interacted with. It would deny anything having to do with, let's say, the supernatural. Right? Clearly, if it's materialistic, the supernatural is immediately excluded from that. So this is where, again, a lot of this starts. Oh yeah, there are cookies, guys. I have cookies, I have water. So this is one question, but it's based on this idea of materialism. The other thing that transhumanism is naturalistic. So it would see itself as an extension of evolution, and because of that, progress can and should be self-directed. So we have this idea of progress over time. It's perfectly reasonable to think, well, couldn't that simply be influenced in a way and be self-directed? Wouldn't that make more sense rather than just waiting for chance to kind of figure things out all by itself? And the other thing that ultimately becomes a primary value is utility and efficiency. Right? So this progress is occurring for a reason, and it's almost always utilitarian or some sort of efficiency. Going back to kind of the better is better analogy from the astronaut in that movie. So it's a natural extension. It ought to be directed, and ultimately, whether you like it or not, you're always going to select the things that are have the most utility or the most efficiency. So again, these are, I think, some other questions. Well, what does it mean then to be created in the imago Dei, in the image of God? Does that have any place in this thinking? Is dignity and value, are they intrinsic? Are they intrinsic to the thing itself? Or must that thing have some sort of utility before it becomes worth valuing or being considered important? And the real question is, all of this kind of gets back to this historical thing called eugenics. Is this just a new eugenics movement? Eugenics, late 1800s, early part of the 1900s, was really the cutting edge of science. The scientific community, for all intents and purposes, gave this their approval, and you will see it played out, believe it or not, in places like Lynchburg. There used to be a hospital in Lynchburg, or in the environs of it, where they would have forced sterilizations of folks here. So right here in Lynchburg, that was the thing. This was common throughout the world. And frankly, eugenics, which basically is a self-directed evolutionary process, but at the time, since they didn't have access to the actual genome, to DNA, etc., the way they achieved this was just by breeding. So you would allow certain people to breed, and you would discourage others to breed, and eventually the right people would overwhelm or advance enough, and the wrong people wouldn't. And we see that most clearly in Nazi Germany. Not that everything's not always about Hitler. I mean, you guys get online, you get on Reddit, and But what is it? Five seconds in, you're talking about Hitler. This is something that actually specifically deals with Hitler, because his view of racial Darwinianism was justified by the scientific community, saying that evolution, this progress, ought to be directed. So really, how much different? That would be my question. How much different is this from the eugenics movement? And we already have history regarding how that went. And it goes to your point about control, ultimately, right? Because if you want to speed this up, you don't want to just have things go forward. You want to literally get rid of the things holding you back. And you don't just wait around for them to just kind of move off the scene. You do things like kill whole races. You have entire, genocides occur. The reality with the technological issue is that it becomes, I think, less a part of race, but it becomes really an issue of who has the enhancement and who hasn't. So it's a little different in terms of the eugenics movement that was really kind of biologically and race-based, which was still hard. But at that point, the real question is, and it goes back to your question about who decides, or is this egalitarian? How can you not have this class structure emerge when you have the enhanced folks, the folks that have enough money and the ability and the access to technology, and the folks that don't? How is that not going to be this classism where some inevitably are better than the others? So what do we do with the folks? What do we do with the folks who aren't enhanced? They can't be enhanced. Are they going to be the worker drones maintaining all of this equipment, all of these other technologies? What are your thoughts on this issue about naturalistic, the fact that this is a naturalistic perspective?
Have they asked whether or not they should?
They've already answered that. We should. The folks that are in this movement they're running full steam ahead. The only thing holding them back is like actual technology.
Yeah, but have they really? By that I mean like, let me use the example of Jurassic Park. Yes, they essentially went through and asked like whether or not they should. Like, yeah, we had the resources to do it, and we would get more money by doing it. So let's do it. And like all the materialistic things, so to speak, were aligning in favor of like making Jurassic Park, but they never actually stopped to consider any of the potential consequences that might come from that.
Yeah. We spend so much time
much later down the line. Not just simply good that they dream of, but also the bad that naturally comes of it. There is always a drawback to whatever you bring in to this world, so to speak.
Well, I would only use the actual eugenics movement that historically occurred as evidence, as Exhibit A, as to why would anybody do this. Because we have. There's nothing in our history that tells me that there's going to be any thoughtful, restrained perspective on this. Unless it's forced, right? Eugenics is not a popular movement as of today. We saw what happened and then we kind of backtracked from it. Not that we couldn't have already said what was going to happen, and there were voices that were saying that. They were unheeded, of course. So it's not that we are forced to go there per se, but there are people who are convinced that they should, yes. The real question is, which voices will prevail, right? So this is part of having this discussion. Part of this is for your own understanding of what this movement is, but also thinking about, your place in this, because we all have a role. Especially, you guys are in school, you guys are going to be the future leaders and influencers, and not like on social media. I don't mean that kind of influencer. But you're going to be the ones influencing these kinds of decisions, especially you're in the sciences or in the IT field itself. You are going to be, at some point, I'm sure, faced with this at a small or bigger level. It might be writing a computer program that is so addictive that people won't want to stay off of it. Like, that's not per se part of this transhumanist trajectory, but you see how that could enter into this idea of how to use technology to control people. That's just as good. As much as these guys want for themselves to, let's say, live forever or to not have disease, et cetera, I have no hope that is going to stay in a box and just stay within its own limits. That inevitably people are going to want to use that technology to control people. It just makes perfect sense, and why wouldn't you? So this is one of those issues. And again, part of this discussion is making sure that you understand it so you can have a voice. So besides being naturalistic, this is also humanistic. And humanism seeks the freedom and welfare of the human species. And to a certain extent, we can say that we're all humanists, I think. But what it emphasizes is personal and morphological choice. So it's not just what you choose for yourself, but how do you express it? And this is an issue that we see more and more today, frankly, in like the transgender movement, where your choice to be what you want to be is not limited by your physicality. So there are connections here, and this is, if you will, a half step. It doesn't go much further beyond that to just not just kind of wipe away the differences between male and female and kind of blur those issues, but blur the issues between man and machine, right? The body and technology. This is sort of a half step there. Not to mention they would also include non-human and sort of artificial intelligence. So this is a whole brave new world, right? So we know that the mind exists in organic creatures. Well, could something like that exist in some sort of electronic or mechanical or non-human creature? Could that thing be artificially created? These are big questions. These are big questions. So now you've got perhaps a whole section or sector of creatures or beings that now need rights, perhaps, or need to be protected, or I'm not sure where that might go. But the question is, who decides? This is going back to your point. Who decides what's best for humanity? And to your question specifically, who decides who can participate? Someone will decide who will participate. And by chance, it's always the ones with a lot of money.
I have a question. How many of you guys have seen the movie 2012?
She has.
One scene in particular reminds me of this question, where essentially they are building this ark, if you will, and they're trying to essentially save humanity. But the thing is, it can't fit everybody on board. There's only so much capacity, and essentially prior to the ships being complete and ready to sail, people have already started buying tickets to essentially save themselves and their close possessions and stuff like that. What made me think a lot is the fact that essentially you had to be in the in crowd in order to be saved. And if you didn't have that ticket, sucks to be you.
Yeah, and that is the practicality of this, right? In there are going to be limited resources. You can only make so many machines. You can only make so many computers. Who gets the computer? Who gets the augmentation, etc. And it's going to be either who nepotism or bribe or extortion, etc. Or you're going to just be wealthy enough to be able to do it. And there are going to be folks who are left out. But the interesting thing is, as much as this enhancement is this drive to enhance, it inevitably can never actually stop. Right? Once you begin down this road, there is no such thing as saying, okay, we've had enough. And you guys all seen The Incredibles growing up? You guys see The Incredibles? I need to show you.
And just when all hope is lost, Syndrome will save the day! I'll be a bigger hero than you ever were.
You mean you killed off real heroes so that you could pretend to be one?
Oh, I'm real. Real enough to defeat you! And I did it without your precious gifts, your oh-so-special powers. I'll give them heroics. I'll give them the most spectacular heroics anyone's ever seen! And when I'm old and I've had my fun, I'll sell my inventions so that everyone can be superheroes. Everyone can be super! And when everyone's super, no one will be.
So when everyone is super, no one will be. So let's just change that up. If everyone is enhanced, then no one is enhanced. Because there can't be sort of a bar at which this thing stops. Inevitably, the impetus is going to be to enhance again and enhance again. And whatever equilibrium is sort of established, well, that just becomes normal, mundane, run-of-the-mill. This mindset, this philosophy is always about progress. So there's no such thing as being, let's say, equally enhanced. Right? Let's just say somebody had a broad mind and all the money and resources and said, everybody gets enhanced, right? And everybody's equal. That'll last about, 8 minutes, right? Before somebody wants to be more enhanced. more cognitively superior, more physically superior, etc., etc. You see how this perspective is an incessant drive. And the real goal, if you wanted to be sort of enhanced per se, never really quite is attainable, because there's always going to be another technology, etc. And we're sort of wrapping up, but ultimately transhumanism, I think we can say, is post-human. And this isn't my pejorative term. They will use this term. Post-human really means an escape from physical limitations. So these things are no longer even considered. So the natural trajectory is from transhumanism, to post. So trans is sort of on the way, kind of enhanced or beyond. But post is really an ultimate denial of that. Let me just finish this real quick.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And frankly, if you really think about it, this is about Gnosticism. And its ultimate victory is singularity. Gnosticism is the dichotomy between the spiritual and the physical, right? It's a huge problem, especially in the ancient world. And the Christian church had to deal with it because, of course, even folks in the church were like, well, of course, the spiritual is superior to the physical, right? And Gnosticism would make the point that ultimately the physical is evil and we have to supersede it. Shocking how similar some of these things really have to do. We're trying through transhumanism to become a post-human creature, if that's even possible, to actually leave the thing that actually makes us humans behind entirely. And this is what I said before about the idea of kind of transgenderism and why this is sort of a similar concept, and we can kind of see what's happening there and see how this other thing might affect this idea of transhumanism. Ultimately, transgender means post-gender, where we will no longer talk about gender. We will not talk about sex per se. If these things are easily switched on and off, or you can have 57 genders, etc., etc., what does that even mean anymore? That we even talk about this thing called sex? We don't even talk about sex anymore. We talk about gender, which is an expression. Well, that gets wiped away. How is that not the same? How are we not going to go from this transhumanism sort of enhancement to really this post-human annihilation of what humanity actually means physically? Because the question then becomes, well, what is left? How much can you take away of the humanness, our physicality, before literally nothing is left? Now, they would say when you lose all that, what you have left is some sort of consciousness or some sort of, we would say soul, right? It's kind of funny. You can't talk about these things without using these terms. But they wouldn't. They wouldn't say that. But that is the question. So what's left? What is left? Well,
I don't have any.
I'm not trying to depress you. I'm really not. The purpose in having this conversation is we need to be part of it. Because frankly, of all the folks who know what these tools might be used for in a helpful, useful, ameliorative, or restorative way, it's the church. We should be the ones stating some of these boundaries, because we've learned, and again, the eugenics movement is a prime example. The scientific consensus was that this movement was perfectly viable and needed to be pushed. That was the best minds. Settled science, if you will, back in the day. It was a disaster. What we've learned is that they are not the ones who ought to be making these decisions, is the reality. They cannot be making these decisions by themselves. Now, should we make all the decisions for them? That would be just as bad, frankly. But the discussion does need to be had. So we need to understand what's going on. And I'm going to go to C.S. Lewis because he's great in all things, but particularly in this, he understood this. This was written in 1943. And he says, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. So technology, if you will, especially the way some folks really are pushing this, as much as they want it to be, or they say, it's egalitarian for all of us, all it really does is allow certain folks to harness the power of that technology to make other men do what they want them to do. This is, to your point, right, about what mankind does with power, etc. So this is in a work called The Abolition of Man. Highly recommend that you read it. It's fantastic. But again, this is where we stand And we have half measures that are already kind of pushing us this way. So even something as simple as your phone, how much time you spend online, you have to step back and say, how is this priming me? How is this changing me? And literally the fact that if you were to lose your phone, if you were to drop it in a sewer, I mean, your heart almost stops. I mean, why is that? Like, it wouldn't be the same if you dropped like a hammer in the toilet, right? You wouldn't have the same reaction. But there's something about this technology that it really has kind of entered into something of our personality, if you will, our consciousness. Now, I have a phone. I don't see myself getting rid of it anytime soon. So I'm not advocating that we all turn Amish and get on our horses and go plow the fields. I'm not saying that. But there is a conversation that needs to be had, and you guys are part of that. So final thoughts, because that's it for me. As far as presentation goes.
Like on the one hand, it seems like this is all very new. This has never happened before in like thousands of years.
Not new at all.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, in the other sense, it's not new at all because it's like the same old man wants more, man wants power, man wants wealth, and he ultimately does more to find it, and then because man's corrupted, people end up getting stressed. And in that sense, I think it's also the same response as in like, we're not going to be able to stop people from getting more powerful or more wealthy or being able to create these technologies to some extent, wherever they end up going. But it will be the same old battle of fighting in a whole bunch of different perspectives. Christians will have to be involved legally in just awareness of what the stuff is. Like, I'm a computer scientist, other people are in medics, biology, we theologians, it's like a huge intersection of fields.
And the reality is, because it's not new, one thing to be encouraged by is, through all these changes, historically and otherwise, the church has still survived. The church has always been the thing, frankly, that has survived where all these other philosophies and movements have failed. So in that regard, be encouraged. I want to encourage you. So I did this thing. There's all these AI things online you can try, so I decided to try it. So what I did was, this is my little Frankenstein guy. There's a story about this, but Frankenstein goes to this issue completely, right? Mad scientist, tries to create life, ends up destroying him. So I decided to type in this program that did artwork, and I said, I want a cute chibi Frankenstein holding a flower. And a chibi is like one of these little dudes, like a woman. So what I got was this, which is pretty cool, right? Not too bad. But I also got some other things. So this is more of a 3D one, and it's starting to get a little stranger. Then I got this guy, who's actually kind of scary. I don't know if you can see it yet. And then this other guy. So, same program. it was a little experiment just to kind of see, okay, where could these things go? But the reality is that all these options are on the table, right? This is the problem, if you will, with technology when it's unguided. What you put in isn't really the issue. It's what you get out of it that's problematic. So to that end, my wife and I are going to have a dinner tomorrow night at our home. If you're interested in joining us, we're going to watch a movie called Ghost in the Shell that deals with these issues. If you are not part of our group meet, please get on our group meet. There's a poll in there that's going to tell us how many people are coming, and we'll give you addresses. But we're going to watch a movie, and I'm going to show you a quick trailer for it real quick. You got it right?
What's a simulated experience again? All your memories about your wife and daughter are false. They're like a dream. Someone's taken advantage of you. They were trying to make you ghost hack into some government officials. Do you understand what I'm saying?
But that can't be. I had a picture of her. She was there. The truth is, you've never had a wife or kid. Like he said, they aren't real. They're a simulated experience. A fantasy.
Are we talking about the puppet master? The infamous mystery hacker?
We don't know a lot either. No clue about age, sex, or background. All we know for certain is this person is on the international most wanted list for crimes including stock manipulation, illegal information gathering, political engineering, several acts of terrorism. The nickname Puppet Master comes from the ghost hacking.
My code name is Project 2501. I am a living, thinking entity who was created in the sea of information. consciousness, information, even a simulated experience or a dream, simultaneous reality and fantasy.
The net is vast and infinite.
Ghost in the shell.
So it's a great movie. If you want to come to our house, we're going to have dinner, we're going to watch a movie, and we'll continue some of this discussion then if you are so interested. But that's it for tonight. I really am grateful that you guys came. Please join our group me so that you can be apprised of all our events. This is just one of the things that we do. Kendra.
And if somebody needs a ride, like
yes.
if you are on campus, you don't have a car, let the group me chat know, and we'll make sure you get a ride.
We will have rides available, so that will be great. Thank you, people. Thank you. Thank you.